Our first speaker is Peter Slovinsky from the Maine Geological Survey. Pete is a marine geologist and expert in assessing the vulnerability of environments to coastal hazards like erosion, storm surge, and sea level rise. With nearly 20 years of experience in coastal geology, he's worked extensively with coastal communities on resilience and adaptation strategies. And Pete's going to speak on Casco Bay bluff erosion. We'll have a little Q&A after that. Please welcome Pete.
Testing. Okay. Let's get my presentation up here. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to join us. And I'm going to spend about 15 minutes this morning setting the stage for the rest of the speakers and speaking a little bit about some of the features and processes that are really important to the coastal bluffs we have in Casco Bay and along the rest of the Maine shoreline. So if you looked at a map of the entire Maine shoreline, we have over 5,000 miles of coastline, tidally influenced coastline, and about 50% of that is made up of rocky cliffs like Portland Head Light that we see here. Now, a cliffed coastline basically is made up of greater than 3 feet of rocky ledge and less than 3 feet of sediment on top of that. The key is if you have greater than 3 feet of sediment on top of that, it will be classified as a coastal bluff. And cliffs are very, very slow to change. They change mostly on a geologic time scale, but in response to storm events, sometimes you can have erosion of cliffs. So in this case, we're seeing boulders that have been loosened, that have fallen off the face of the cliff, okay? So erosion can occur along these features. About 48% of Maine's coastline is classified as unconsolidated coastal bluff. And based on our last assessment from about 2000, about a third of those are eroding, okay? So we need to update that assessment because I suspect that number is higher now. So unconsolidated bluffs, which is what these are called, they're steep shorelines with more than 3 feet of soil, and they're typically underlain by several different adjacent habitat types. First, in this example, is ledge. So you've got rocky ledge, but you've got greater than 3 feet of soil on top of that. We also have sections of the shoreline that have been armored with riprap and things like that. So that adjacent habitat type is armor, but again, it's got 3 feet of soil above it, so that classifies as a coastal bluff. And a lot of what we see in terms of coastal bluffs, and this example is from Long Island, is adjacent sand flats or beaches. Okay, that's one of the most common shoreline types adjacent to coastal bluffs. And it's features like this beach that derive its sediment from the erosion of that adjacent bluff. We also commonly see vegetated wetlands, and this is a little pocket of wetland next to the Bunganuk Bluff in McCoy Bay. And you can see this is a very, very high bluff, and then it's eroding. So all of the sediment that's eroding off the face of that bluff is supplying sediment to the adjacent mud flat and also that vegetated coastal wetland. So coastal bluffs are integral to the health of these adjacent habitat types. Without coastal bluffs, we would not have a lot of the mud flats, a lot of the sand flats, a lot of the beaches, and a lot of the vegetated coastal wetlands that we see in Casco Bay. So I'm going to quickly show you some of the features of a bluff, and then we'll talk about what's called the bluff erosion cycle. And I've taken these slides from Tracy Summers. She took some of my slides and added her beautiful graphic design to them. So I think they're really, they tell the story pretty well. So first of all, the features on a bluff. If you're going from the landward side, whoa, okay. It does not want to hear about the bluff anatomy. From the landward side to the seaward side, you're going to be seeing at the wrong slide. Okay. The bluff crest right here, and as you go down the steep face of the bluff, you end up with the bluff face that extends from the bluff crest down to the bluff toe. The bluff toe is where we typically see a lot of the erosion that occurs, and then that transitions into some type of intertidal habitat. So let's go through this bluff erosion cycle. And it's called a cycle because this is the way bluffs shed sediment and also how bluffs protect themselves from long-term sea level rise and coastal storm events. So at time 1, you've got a steep bluff. Time 2, let's say there's a storm that hits. You get undermining of the toe, so this becomes unstable right here. So guess what happens at time 3? You get a landslide or slope failure. This is called a block failure, where you have these blocks that roll down the face of the bluff and sediment is being introduced in the intertidal zone here. At time 4, that spreads out into the intertidal zone, and it's basically, this becomes a much less steep slope, so it kind of stabilizes itself. And at the same time, this helps stabilize the toe because it causes waves to break out here so that this isn't being eroded anymore. And then over time, that gets colonized with vegetation, okay? So this is the way the bluff system kind of responds to sea level rise, responds to storms, and protects itself. Yet at the same time, this is also integral, like I said, to providing sediment to those adjacent habitat types. Again, mudflats, sand beaches, dunes, wetlands, and shellfish flats. And one of the key differences between bluffs and any of the other things we can be talking about, like coastal sand dunes, like coastal wetlands, things like that, is bluffs do not reform in our lifetimes, at least not that I've seen. They are eroding one way. They're not ephemeral. They don't disappear and then come back. They don't erode, then accrete. They are eroding one way in response to sea level rise in the long term. There are other factors, of course, that influence bluff stability. I talked a little bit about relief and slope, so how high it is and how steep it is. You know, what is it made of? If it's a rock, it's not really eroding in our lifetimes. Is it underlain by bedrock? Is it made of clay? Is it made of sand? Sandy bluffs erode faster typically than clay bluffs. But the two I really want to focus on is what we call bluff hydrology, and then directly related to that is upland land management. Okay, what are we doing on the surface adjacent to the bluff? That has a really, really, really important factor in terms of what happens to that bluff. So, bluff hydrology. We've got an undeveloped coastal bluff here with lots of vegetation on the top. You can still have issues with this bluff because of hydrology, groundwater flow. Let's say there's a pond up here, or just the way the groundwater is in the face of this bluff. It will move through this system in a seaward direction and then come out of the face of the bluff in many cases, okay? It's just the way things go. Gravity causes groundwater to flow in a seaward direction. So you can have failure of a completely natural bluff because simply of groundwater. And one thing we see when we're looking at these is we will see in the winter, we will see frozen bulges. We'll see icicles hanging off the face of the bluff. And a completely undeveloped bluff, natural bluff, that's because of groundwater flow. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Heavy precipitation events, okay, contribute to surface runoff. So you get a lot of rain falling on this bluff. It's a natural bluff, so that vegetation can soak up a lot of it, all right? But what happens is you'll still have runoff that occurs where you literally have surface flow that comes over the bluff and down, but you also have penetration of some of this, so it's exacerbating that groundwater flow, all right? Then you mix in freeze-thaw that happens in our springtime, where the bluff actually freezes and it contracts and then warms and it expands. That causes more instability. So maintaining a proper vegetative buffer up in here is really, really important because it mimics having a natural vegetated place up there. So upland land management is integrally linked to bluff hydrology because what we do influences bluff hydrology. So in this example, and this is typical what we see on most coastal bluffs, we have a house. We've got all of the vegetation cleared except for very large trees adjacent to the bluff. It's a beautiful setting. It's beautiful to see. The big trees look really nice. This lawn does not soak up anything. It soaks up very, very little in terms of precipitation. And we're getting more and heavier precipitation events that are happening in shorter periods of time. At the same time, when rain falls, we have structures. So we've got paved driveways, we've got houses that can cause runoff that comes off the face of this. And because this isn't soaking up enough water, because it's just lawn, not native vegetation or shrubs and grasses, it comes off and adds to the flow, okay, in terms of surface runoff that comes off. These large trees on the end also can create more instability because they're large, they have big root systems, and they're right next to the edge of the bluff, all right? And they're not stabilized very well. So these can fail also. There's no other vegetation here to help stabilize that bluff. We also, because of the lack of vegetation, have more water that's coming down. And this is coming off the driveway, this is coming off the house, and then down, and it's mixing with the groundwater, and you end up with what we call supersaturated bluff. That kind of management weakens the ability of our bluffs to adapt to heavy precipitation events. Very, very important. What does that look like? So this is an example from Great Diamond Island in the Cove. We got surface runoff that literally comes off the building here, pools in here, and it's leading to a hot spot right here. We also have extensive lawn. There's no trees or shrubs that are there, so there's no native buffer zone to help break up that heavy precipitation. Signs of groundwater influence. I mean, this is pretty apparent, but this is from Long Island. You can see the frozen water in the bluff face. You can see icicles hanging off the face of the bluff. You see the frozen water actually pooling on the ground. And there's also extensive water-loving vegetation, hydrophilic vegetation that really likes to be in areas that are seeing a lot of groundwater. Okay. So how do we actually classify these things? We call them basically unstable or highly unstable in certain areas. We go and we map them. We've mapped the Long Island and Diamond Islands just recently. We're looking for steep and high relief, toe erosion, root creep, and or leaning or fallen trees. So you can see trees that have fallen down here. And we typically will see trees that are hanging off the face of the bluff, and they're growing like this. Trees grow like this if they're stable. If they're unstable, gravity is pulling their root systems down, and they're growing like this. There's little to no vegetation on the face of the bluff, and then there's evidence of groundwater. Stable bluffs, conversely, are the opposite. You see large trees growing vertically. There is some, area denuded of vegetation here, but in general, we're not seeing a lot of instability in an example like this. So we do put out our bluff stability maps, and we update them on a fairly regular basis. There are a lot that need to be updated. Again, most of them are from about to the year 2000 or 2002. This one we're in the process of updating for both of the islands. I'd like to finish talking about some of other habitats that are near coastal bluffs that are not currently classified, like ledge, flats, and most of these are dune related. Okay, the most common dune system that we actually see on the islands are really what we call small perched dune systems. This is an example from Chebeague. And they're little tiny dune systems. I mean, here's the bluff. This is probably 25 or 30 feet wide. It's pretty low in elevation. And these are really ephemeral. They get hit by storms, they disappear, the sand goes offshore, sand comes back, they reappear. So they are ephemeral systems. They're very, very dynamic. We do have larger pocket sand dunes. This is an example from Wreck Cove on Long Island. So you've got a rocky cliff here, a little bit of a coastal bluff that then goes into this cove. This is the sand dune system. And then we have large sand dune systems. This is over on Long Island. Great, thanks. And you've got a large expanse of sandy beach, and you have what we have mapped as front dunes and back dunes. And these are actually mapped by the state and are part of a sand dune system. So what's important about these systems is how dynamic they are. And Tracy came up with this great thing. So what happens is during the summer months, you have a big berm. You've got a dune crest over here. During the winter months, when storms come, this berm gets eroded, okay? The dune gets eroded. All the sand gets pulled offshore into sandbars, all right? So the sand is actually stored off here during the winter months. You have nothing over here. This dune system is pretty much gone in the winter month. However, in the summer, sand comes back. So smaller waves push sand back up, and you get berm growth in this area and then dune recovery in this area. Allowing these systems to recover in a natural sense is really, really important, because large storms like we saw in December and January will knock out a lot of these smaller dunes, yet they will recover over a period of a year or two. We do put out dune maps that allow end users to go out and kind of look and see what regulated dune system looks like. They're mapped basically as front dune, back dune, and what we call an erosion hazard area, which is where we expect the shoreline to potentially erode over the next 100 years. These maps are constantly evolving and changing. The dune maps, as you saw, dunes are very ephemeral. The maps themselves are based off of topographic data that we've collected using airplanes and also aerial imagery. We're not mapping every single dune in the state. We've tried and we've failed. We've missed a lot, and we've also missed some areas, and we've also mapped areas that look like dunes that when you look at them closer are not dunes. So these maps are constantly evolving. So I do have a bunch of resources here that'll kind of set the stage that I'm sure people can at their own leisure peruse on coastal bluff maps, coastal bluff resources. We also have a coastal property owner's guide, which covers all of the things that I've kind of talked about today. And then some information on living shorelines. So this presentation hopefully is going to set the stage for the rest of the speakers in terms of the ways we can adapt our coastal bluffs. And I want to thank GDI and I want to thank GPCOG for helping us with the imagery, of capturing this imagery, and Captain Christian LaMontagne, who graciously donated his boat for 2 days of beautiful weather in April for us to go out and fly the islands and actually remap the islands. So I am done with that. Thank you.
So we've got a couple of minutes for questions. If anybody has a question for Pete at this point. Tim?
Do we want to mic them?
Yeah. Well,
is it on? I don't know.
This
That one's
one's
on.
on?
Yeah.
Awesome. There you go.
Tim Honey from
Sam.
Long Island.
How are you?
Good to see you.
Likewise.
The issue that we're confronted with on Front Beach are the trees, and we don't know what to do in terms of managing these trees. Small trees, very large trees, some ready to fall on the beach, others starting to do it. And so we just feel helpless because we can't get anybody to help us with managing the trees. Should they be cut? Should they be thinned? Should more be planted? We don't know what to do.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So one of the issues associated with trees, so people that aren't familiar with this, there's a very, very large steep bluff on Long Island. And on the top of it, there are some very large trees, and on the face of the bluff, there are some very large trees as well. Shoreline zoning, and Allison might be able to talk more about this, but shoreline zoning currently doesn't really allow you to cut trees unless they're considered to be hazard trees. Each community defines hazard trees differently. Some say it's not a hazard tree unless infrastructure is at risk from that tree. Others are a little bit more lenient and say you can cut the tree if it's causing instability, et cetera, et cetera. So in a perfect world, we wouldn't have to cut trees, but large rooted trees that are on a face of a bluff that are showing signs of failure, from a geological context, one of the best things you can do for that tree is actually to cut the tree but not remove the root ball. You leave the root ball in there because if you think about it, when a big tree falls and that root system pulls up, it's pulling large volumes of sediment with it, okay? And it's actually increasing some of the instability in the bluff by pulling that off. Sometimes it's making it steeper, sometimes it's exposing other sections of clay and things like that. So I think working with the community to figure out how tree management plays a role in the stability of the bluff is going to be really, really important. At the same time, in that area, I know there are lawns that come right to the edge of the bluff. So increasing vegetated buffers is going to be very important because if you walk along Front Beach during the spring, you can see a lot of groundwater that's flowing through the face of the bluff. There is also evidence of the freeze-thaw cycle that we talked about. There's icicles that hang off. So we know groundwater is an issue. So increasing vegetative buffers, which I think you guys might be talking about a little bit, is pretty important. Even like 10 feet can be really helpful. And we do have a coastal bluff planting guide that we worked on with the Cumberland County Soil and Water Conservation District that can be very helpful in terms of specifying the kinds of vegetation that, number one, make their home on steep bluffs adjacent to the ocean, and then number two, are really good at sucking up water a little bit farther back from the steep part of the bluff. So that would be my recommendation to kind of work from. In the back, yes.
I wonder if you could give some examples of projects you've worked on for the state of Maine, or is there a place where I can go look at how those have gone with regards to the stabilization techniques?
Sure. I'm not going to steal the thunder from these guys because they're consultants and are going to be talking about some of their projects. One of the projects that I know that just recently got put in that is along 2,000 feet of unstable bluff. And this is kind of one of the projects I think we need to start showcasing a bit more. They're still in the process of finishing it up and monitoring parts of it. It's up in Blue Hill, actually. And it was 2,000 linear feet of eroding bluff and relatively steep, relatively high bluff. And the property owner there could have come in and rip-rapped at the bluff if they wanted to, or tried to get a permit to rip-rap that bluff. They didn't want to do that. They wanted to do something different. So they worked with a consultant up there and went through a very long, drawn-out permit process, because it's the first time we've had something of that scale, to come in and actually kind of recreate a more stable bluff slope and an intertidal habitat that helps protect that bluff. So this project, most projects come in and work above the high tide line only on the bluff. This project went in and worked in the intertidal zone and on the bluff. It regraded the whole bluff slope. That's one of the things that you can certainly do in unstable areas if there's room, is to make a bluff more stable, is to regrade that slope. A lot of steep slope bluffs are like 2-to-1 or even steeper, or 1-to-1 even. And so regrading that bluff back to a more stable slope is very, very important. That's why keeping distance between structures and the crest of the bluff is really important. Shoreland zoning requires that there's a minimum of 75 feet of setback on a coastal bluff from either the high tide line or the top of the bluff, depending on whether it's a stable bluff or an unstable bluff. 75 feet is not enough. It really isn't. It's not. We need to, at the state level, we need to address that by increasing setbacks. And then communities and property owners can also be proactive in thinking about, if I'm building something on top of a bluff, bluffs, even though they could be mapped as stable, can become unstable. But anyway, that project in Blue Hill, I think, is really important because it showcases a lot of these techniques that use logs, coir products, planting vegetation in the intertidal zone, so reestablishing marshes that have kind of been eroded over time, and then using plantings throughout the face of the bluff to help stabilize it. So I hope that we can get that case study in front of you folks in the near future.